On Sunday, March 19th, 1978, a 15-year-old boy named Willie Bosket was roaming the New York City subways, hunting for his next victim. This wasn't new for Willie. Since the age of 9, he had been tangled in the juvenile justice system, repeatedly brought before Manhattan's family court for various charges. But by now, he had learned a harsh reality. Those courtroom sentences held little weight. The system's leniency only emboldened him. At the time, Willie was waiting for a hearing on an attempted robbery charge. Adding to the confusion in his life was the news that a well-meaning couple had begun the process of adopting him as a foster child. His biological father was serving time in prison, and his mother had all but given up on him. Willie was left drifting, his future uncertain and his present filled with anger. With the adoption papers still being processed by the state, Willie was left to his own devices, wandering the city's underbelly. One evening, he stumbled upon what seemed like a lucky break. While riding the subway, he found a sleeping passenger's wallet loaded with $380. To most teenagers, that kind of money would have felt like a small fortune. But for Willie, it was a means to an end. Power. He took the money and used part of it to buy a gun from Charles, a man who was staying with his mother in Harlem. Charles was no role model. In fact, he was a man hardened by the streets. He fed Willie's impressionable mind with the belief that carrying a gun meant gaining respect. It was a brutal lesson about survival, control, and fear. For $65, Charles sold Willie a .22 caliber pistol. Willie even purchased a holster to strap the weapon to his leg, something that made him feel more powerful than he'd ever felt before. The weight of the gun against his thigh became a twisted reassurance. By 5:30 that Sunday afternoon, Willie found himself riding the number 3 IRT train. The subway car was nearly empty, just him and another passenger, a middle-aged man dressed casually but sporting a flashy gold digital watch. The man was dozing, his head tilted back, his breathing steady. Willie's eyes locked onto the gold watch. That watch could be sold for quick cash, another opportunity to build his reputation. With calculated coldness, he moved closer and kicked the man's foot to test if he was truly asleep. The man didn't stir. Encouraged by this, Willie began sliding the watch off the man's wrist. But then he noticed something odd, something that made his blood boil. The man was wearing pink sunglasses. The sight of them triggered something deep inside Willie. They reminded him of a counselor from juvenile detention, a man Willie had despised with every fiber of his being. It wasn't just the color of the glasses. It was the arrogance he associated with them. It irritated him to his core. Suddenly, the man's eyes snapped open, startled awake by the subtle tug of his watch. In a heartbeat, Willie's hand went for his gun. With no hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the right lens of the sunglasses, blasting into the man's brain. But to Willie's horror, the man didn't die instantly. Instead, he threw up his hands and screamed, his voice echoing through the near-empty subway car. Panic gripped Willie's mind. The man was supposed to be dead, silenced. Afraid that his victim might survive, Willie fired another shot, desperate to finish what he had started. The man Willie had just shot collapsed against the subway wall, his body sliding down until he crumpled onto the floor, motionless. As the train approached its final stop near Yankee Stadium, Willie wasted no time. His hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline, but his focus was sharp. He rifled through the man's pockets, finding $15 in cash, which he quickly stuffed into his own pockets. Then he spotted a ring on the man's finger. With a few tugs, he slid it off and tucked it away. The gold digital watch, the very object that had first drawn Willie's attention, now felt like a prize. It glittered in his hand, a trophy of his ruthlessness. Without looking back, Willie exited the train and made his way home. On his journey, he sold the ring to a dealer for $20, pocketing the cash with the same cold detachment he had shown when pulling the trigger. To him, the man's life had been worth nothing more than a few dollars. The shooting victim was later identified as No Perez, a 44-year-old hospital worker who lived alone. The newspapers reported the incident as a random act of violence, another senseless killing in a city growing increasingly numb to brutality. With no witnesses and no apparent motive, the case went cold. And that was exactly what Willie wanted. For Willie, The killing marked a turning point. This act of violence felt like his destiny, something he had been moving toward his entire life. His world had been shaped by anger and rejection, and now he had finally done what he had always threatened to do. He had taken a life, and the most empowering part of it all, he had gotten away with it. He even bragged to his sister about what he had done, his words dripping with pride rather than guilt. To him, killing a man was nothing more than a rite of passage, a way to cement his reputation as someone to be feared. He had often boasted that he would be as bad as people said he would be, and now he had proven it. His system that was supposed to guide him had failed, and in his twisted mind, this act of violence was his own form of triumph. But Willie's story didn't start in the concrete jungles of New York City. It had roots stretching far back into a brutal legacy of violence. His ancestors hailed from Edgefield County, South Carolina, one of the most blood-soaked regions in the South. The area's history was tainted with relentless violence dating back centuries. In 1760, the Cherokee tribe massacred scores of settlers in the region. In the aftermath, lawlessness took hold. Homeless men formed vicious gangs, abducting women and torturing wealthy planters to steal their valuables. The chaos was so widespread that the first organized vigilante group, known as the Regulators, emerged here, determined to fight violence with violence. But their brand of justice often slipped into pure brutality, introducing yet another layer of cruelty to the region's history. The American Revolution only worsened the bloodshed. In 1775, a cavalry unit under the command of Bloody Bill Cunningham swept through farms, raiding settlements, and massacring people without mercy. Constant warfare left the area drenched in blood, its residents desensitized to violence. Edgefield County developed a reputation for lawlessness and cruelty, with a murder rate double the state's average. From this brutal environment, a twisted code of honor emerged. Men fought for their pride and reputation, embracing dueling as a way of settling grievances. Even after dueling was outlawed, the practice persisted, romanticized by generations who saw violence as a form of respect. Edgefield County became infamous as a place that bred daredevils and adventurers, men whose identities were built on fearlessness and ferocity. The Edgefield character, as people called it, was defined by intensity, pride, and a readiness to resort to violence when challenged. It was from this unforgiving culture that Willie's ancestors had emerged. They were slaves at a place known as Mount Willing, their lives shaped by the cruelty and savagery that defined the county. This brutal heritage had left deep scars across generations, wounds that had never truly healed. Willie's own journey was just the latest chapter in a long, dark history of violence. And for him, that legacy was something to embrace, not escape. The Bosket family name first appeared on voting records in 1868, shortly after the end of slavery. When the Emancipation Proclamation was declared and slaves were finally freed, many chose to take the surnames of their previous owners. Willie's lineage traced back to an Edgefield planter named John Bowett, who, in 1850, owned an astonishing 221 African slaves. Among those slaves was a man named Reuben, who adopted the Bowett surname. Over time, that name gradually transformed into Bosket. However, Reuben's life was far from stable. He was later sold to another plantation owner, Francis Pickens, who owned over 500 slaves, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the region. Reuben married and had a son named Aaron, who would become Willie's great-great-grandfather. Aaron's life was marked by trauma and exploitation from the beginning. At just 10 years old, he was torn away from his family and sold to a hot-headed master known for his cruelty. The man's rage and harshness were emblematic of the deepening anger and brutality that infected the relationship between slaves and their white owners. Aaron was finally freed in 1865 at the age of 17, when slavery was officially abolished. Yet freedom came with its own set of challenges. He had nothing to his name, no resources or opportunities. Desperate to survive, he signed a labor contract with a local white planter, agreeing to work the land in exchange for a share of the crops. But the system was rigged against him, and he quickly realized that the white men who employed him were essentially cheating him out of his rightful earnings. Despite the overwhelming odds, Aaron did what he had to do to survive. The Ku Klux Klan was on the rise, terrorizing freed slaves across the South, and he knew better than to provoke their wrath. Keeping his head down was a matter of survival. Aaron eventually married and had a son named Clifton, who became known by his nickname, Pud. Unlike his father, Pud was fiercely proud and unwilling to tolerate disrespect from anyone. Reputation meant everything to him. Unlike the older generation, Pud wasn't interested in quietly enduring the white man's oppression. He wanted power, respect, and control over his own destiny. Pud inherited a lighter complexion from his mother's side of the family. Her own father had been white. This granted him certain privileges that darker-skinned black people were often denied. But it also stirred resentment and conflict, both within his community and outside of it. By the time Pud was 21, he was working as a sharecropper in the cotton fields. The work was grueling and relentless, but it was an essential part of life in the South. One day, the plantation's landlord, angry over what he perceived as laziness or disrespect, decided to punish Pud by whipping him in front of everyone. But Pud was not his father. He was not a man who would bow his head and accept humiliation. Instead, Pud reached out, his hand moving like lightning, and snatched the whip from the landlord's grasp. He pulled the man from his wagon and hurled him to the ground, asserting his own power in an act of rebellion that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Then, without hesitation, Pud walked away, leaving the white man stunned and speechless. The incident made Pud a legend in his community. Stories spread quickly about his defiance, his unwillingness to submit to the white man's authority. People began to see him as a force to be reckoned with, someone who had the courage to stand up for himself no matter the consequences. Pud's reputation grew even more notorious when he found himself in desperate need of money. With little choice and anger boiling in his veins, he broke into 2 stores and stole a mere $12. But his crime did not go unpunished. He was arrested, jailed, and then sentenced to a year of hard labor on the county chain gang, a brutal, soul-crushing punishment designed to break a man's spirit. Yet when Pud completed his time and returned to his community, he was greeted as a hero. His time on the chain gang had only solidified his status as a bad man, someone who wouldn't be cowed or controlled. He had become part of a new breed of African-American folk heroes, the Black Bad Men. Men like him were admired for their defiance and courage, for standing up against the cruelty of a racist system that aimed to keep them in their place. For them, respect came not from the approval of society, but from the fear and awe they inspired. But for all his defiance and courage, Pud's legacy was one built on anger, violence, and rebellion. It was a legacy that would be passed down through generations, molding the lives of those who came after him. And for Willie, this dark inheritance would shape his very identity, setting him on a path that seemed almost inevitable. Growing up in a brutal and unforgiving world, the Bosket family had learned not only how to survive, but how to strike back when necessary. Their existence was a constant cycle of fury and desperation, with violence becoming both a shield and a weapon. For Pud, this manifested as an increasing appetite for conflict. His temper was fierce, and he had little patience for disrespect. Insults were often met with the sharp edge of a knife, a testament to the reputation he was determined to maintain. Despite his violent nature, Pud eventually settled down and married, fathering 3 sons, William, Freddie Lee, and James. But stability was never truly part of Pud's life. Tragedy struck when he died in a car accident, leaving his young sons to grow up in the shadow of his turbulent legacy. Even though he was gone, stories of his exploits continued to circulate within the family and community, painting him as a man who refused to be tamed by anyone. The Bosket name carried weight, and it was up to the next generation to uphold its reputation. Pud had earned respect through fear and violence, and his sons learned that this was how power was achieved. His legacy was now their inheritance, and living up to it meant embracing the brutality that had defined their family's history. James, in particular, felt the burden of this expectation. He discovered early on that simply mentioning he was a Bosket was enough to make people back away in fear. Their reactions made him feel powerful, and he wanted nothing more than to emulate the man he had been taught to idolize. "I'm going to grow up to be bad," he would proclaim, his ambition fueled by the stories of his father's violent pride. As James grew older, he began carrying a knife, making sure everyone around him understood that he was a force to be reckoned with. Alcohol soon became part of his life, but rather than dulling his anger, it sharpened it. It made him cruel and unpredictable. His increasingly violent nature was compounded by a serious health issue. He began suffering from seizures, and the combination of his condition and his drinking turned him into a dangerous man. His wife, Marie, bore the brunt of his violent rages. During one of their many arguments, James even fired a gun at her, forcing her to flee the house in terror. Feeling utterly helpless and desperate to protect herself and her child, Marie sought help from the courts, asking for support to care for their infant son, Willie James, nicknamed Butch. But James wasn't the kind of man to submit to the authority of the white man's court. His rage and pride wouldn't allow him to be controlled. Rather than paying support or facing the legal consequences of his actions, he simply fled the state. He began living a life of crime, committing petty robberies, and eventually getting arrested in New Jersey, where he ended up serving time in jail. With James out of the picture, Marie decided to leave as well. At the age of 17, overwhelmed and unable to provide for her child, she made the difficult decision to leave Willie in the care of her mother-in-law, Frances, and set off for Chicago in search of a better life. But life under Frances's roof was anything but nurturing. Young Willie, or Butch as he was called, quickly learned that survival meant fending for himself. Frances was a harsh woman, providing little food and even less affection. She saw something sinister in the boy, claiming that he had the devil in him. Her response to his misbehavior was constant beatings, intended to break his spirit and force him to submit. But the abuse only hardened him. Hungry and desperate, Butch began stealing food whenever he could. If he couldn't find something to eat, he went without. If he found food, he took it without hesitation. His childhood was a relentless struggle against hunger, pain, and loneliness. The streets became his home, and he quickly learned that fighting was the only way to earn respect. In the South, violence was often socially acceptable, especially when it came to defending one's honor. And for Butch, who had no loving attachments or kindness to soften his character, honor meant survival. He became the toughest boy on his street, his fists and rage his only tools for navigating the harsh world around him. Things took a darker turn when James, his father, returned home. Rather than offering support or affection, James brought only more pain. He would often beat Butch viciously with his belt, determined to crush any sign of weakness in his son. His visits were sporadic and brutal, doing nothing but deepening the wounds that already existed within the boy. Marie eventually made her way back from Chicago, but by then, the damage had been done. When she attempted to reunite with Butch, Frances refused to let her inside the house. Rejected and with nowhere else to go, Marie made her way to New York, leaving Butch behind in the only home he had ever known, a home built on violence and suffering. Butch's childhood was now defined by isolation, cruelty, and a simmering anger that grew stronger with every beating, every hungry night, and every rejection. His father's legacy of violence and his grandmother's relentless cruelty had shaped him into someone who believed that power and respect could only be achieved through brutality. Feeling invincible after his previous violent encounters, 15-year-old Willie Bosket was brimming with arrogance and rage. The gun strapped to his leg gave him a sense of power and control he had never experienced before. His cousin, Herman Spates, came to wake him up early that Thursday, March 23rd, 1978, and they quickly set off with a single purpose: making money through violence and intimidation. Their first destination was the number 3 subway train at 148th Street and Lexington Avenue. The train yard was quiet as they scouted for a potential victim. It wasn't long before their eyes landed on Anthony Lomward, a motorman from Brooklyn who was nearing the end of his shift. His task that day involved cutting or adding train cars as required. A routine job he expected to finish without trouble. But trouble had found him. Lomward carried a CB radio, something Willie and Herman believed they could sell on the street for a decent $100. Greed and cruelty spurred them forward, their movements careful and calculated as they followed Lamort from a distance. When Lamort spotted the boys where they clearly didn't belong, his irritation was evident. "You're not supposed to be here," he snapped. "Get the hell out." But Willie was not about to be ordered around by anyone, especially not a white man. In his mind, white authority figures had always been the enemy. With cold defiance, he challenged, "Why don't you come down here and make us get out?" Annoyed but not particularly alarmed, Lamort climbed down the steps of the subway car and started walking toward them. From a distance of about 30 feet, he saw Willie's baby-faced appearance and assumed he was just another kid causing trouble. The man had no idea the danger he was walking into. But as Lamort drew closer, Willie's eyes narrowed, and his hand moved to the gun strapped to his leg. "Give me your radio and your money," Willie demanded, his voice now filled with the authority of the weapon he held. Sensing the threat was all too real, Lamort turned away, trying to make it back to the safety of the subway car. His attempt to flee was met with a sudden popping sound, followed by the feeling of sharp, burning pain radiating through his back and right shoulder. Willie had fired his gun. Despite the injury, Lamort managed to stumble his way to the dispatcher's office, his clothes soaked in blood. "I think I've been shot," he said weakly. His voice trembled with confusion and disbelief. Meanwhile, Willie and Herman wasted no time fleeing the scene. But the shooting only seemed to fuel Willie's newfound sense of superiority. Over the next 3 nights, the two boys embarked on a spree of violent robberies. The thrill of getting away with murder had made Willie feel unstoppable. During one attack, they kicked a man down the steps of the A train station and snatched a mere $12 from his pockets. It wasn't about the money. It was about the power, the fear they inspired. Their next victim was 57-year-old Matthew Connolly. When the older man attempted to resist them, Willie's reaction was swift and brutal. Without hesitation, he shot Connolly in the hip. The man's scream of agony only seemed to amuse the teenage boys. Even when Willie was grabbed and searched by transit authority patrolmen during their spree, his luck held strong. The officer completely missed the gun Willie had managed to hide in his pants. To Willie, it was further proof that he was above the law. He was smarter than the cops, smarter than the courts. Nothing could touch him. Days later, on Monday, March 27th, Willie and Herman were once again prowling the subway system, searching for their next victim. They jumped the turnstile at 135th Street and slipped into the last car of an uptown train. The car was nearly empty, except for a single passenger, a Hispanic man in his late 30s, sitting quietly, his attention somewhere far away. For Willie, it was the perfect opportunity. He posted Herman at the front of the car, knowing the man wouldn't be able to escape at the next stop because of the short platform. The trap was set. Without hesitation, Willie approached the man, his gun already drawn. "Give me your money," he demanded, his eyes cold and unfeeling. The man looked up, startled but defiant. "I ain't got any," he replied, his voice trembling with fear but holding firm. That was the wrong thing to say. Without even pausing, Willie pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in the empty subway car. The man's body slid from the seat to the floor, his blood pooling around him as his life drained away. Willie crouched down and rifled through the man's pockets, his hands moving with casual efficiency. His victim had only $2, an amount so small it was almost insulting. Disgusted, Willie pulled out the man's wallet and found his name, Moses Perez. The name meant nothing to Willie. The man's life meant nothing to him. With a sneer, he tossed the wallet into a nearby trash bin and walked away with Herman, both boys laughing over what they considered nothing more than a casual adventure. The line between life and death was now meaningless to Willie Bosket. His thirst for violence and power was growing stronger with each passing day. Willie Bosket's violent nature had been brewing since childhood. The abusive environment he grew up in, combined with his own unchecked rage and desire for control, made him a formidable threat even at a young age. His mother had already given up on him, believing he would only follow in his father's criminal footsteps. By the age of 11, Willie had become an angry, hostile, and unpredictable child. His violent tendencies were not just temper tantrums. They were full-blown attacks driven by a need to assert dominance. The system he was placed in had no answers for a child like Willie. While most kids were seen as victims of their circumstances, Willie manipulated the system, skillfully using the fact that juveniles were often considered incapable of true criminal intent. As a result, every time he committed a crime, he found his way back to the streets. Violence had become a twisted game that he was good at. His destructive behavior escalated until he reached a point of no return. By the age of 15, he exhibited signs of grandiosity, narcissism, poor impulse control, and a willingness to resort to violence at any moment. His record included numerous self-harm attempts, daily threats against others, and a blatant disregard for human life. During his evaluation, he was diagnosed with antisocial behavior, considered just a step away from the antisocial personality disorder diagnosis that had once been given to his father. Willie wasn't psychotic, but he was certainly dangerous, and the people around him knew that it was only a matter of time before his violence claimed a life. Armed with Willie's dark history and the overwhelming evidence of his crimes, Assistant District Attorney Robert Silberling prepared for the trials. The hearings were held at the Family Court Building on Lafayette Street in Lower Manhattan. Willie faced 3 separate felony charges, 2 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder. Judge Edith Miller, who had encountered Willie before, couldn't comprehend how someone so bright could be so deeply troubled. But this time, Willie's arrogance was on full display. He was so belligerent that he needed to be restrained. His vulgar, foul-mouthed manner shocked the courtroom. But what disturbed the judge the most was his complete lack of empathy for his victims or their families. He even forced the widow of Moses Perez to testify that she had indeed identified her husband's body. His cruelty knew no bounds, and during his time at the Spofford Juvenile Center, he had already attacked others, stabbing another boy with a fork, hitting a counselor in the face, and even choking a psychiatrist. Later, Willie would boast about his violent exploits, claiming to have committed over 2,000 crimes, including 25 stabbings. He approached his trials with a chilling sense of detachment, not understanding, or perhaps not caring, that this time the system was trying to hold him accountable. When he finally grew tired of the process, Willie impulsively instructed his lawyer to enter a plea of guilty to all 3 counts. Silberling insisted he must plead guilty to all the charges, and Willie agreed without hesitation. But despite the severity of his crimes, the maximum sentence under the new laws was just 5 years. Willie was handed over to the Division of Youth, with a release date set for when he would turn 21. Once again, the system proved itself incapable of dealing with a child who had already embraced the life of a predator. Only 2 days after Willie's sentencing, a trial that had drawn massive local media attention, New York Governor Hugh Carey was flying from Manhattan to Rochester for a campaign appearance. His political rival was attacking him for being too lenient on crime and was pushing for a new law allowing juveniles to be tried as adults for heinous crimes like murder and rape. As Carey read the morning papers, he came across an article detailing Willie's sentence. What should have been a confidential case had been leaked to the press. The headline quoted Herman Spates saying, "Willie killed because he got a kick out of blowing them away." That one quote sent shockwaves through the political landscape. The public was outraged, and lawmakers knew they couldn't ignore the issue any longer. It was Willie Bosket's case that ultimately pushed New York to change its juvenile justice system forever. Moral: Willie Bosket's story is a tragic reminder of how broken systems, neglect, and a toxic environment can create a monster. It also shows us that accountability must be balanced with genuine efforts to reform and rehabilitate. The failure to intervene early and properly allowed his violent tendencies to grow unchecked. The question remains, how many others are slipping through the cracks of a system not built to truly help them?